How do you top the greatest band of all time? You can't. Because the reason this band is the most popular group in history is because of their flawless songs. Songs that have been covered more than any artist in history, more than 1 million times at last count. But there was this one time that a gravelly voiced madman did outdo the greatest band ever. And he did it by spazzing out on the biggest stage in rock history. After his performance, after his rendition, people couldn't stop talking about his insane antics. But clear back when the original band wrote this song, one of the legendary members who got to sing the lead vocal on it was very concerned about one of the lyrics in the song, and he refused to sing it unless the band changed it. Would they change it? Oh, and it's also one of the most misunderstood songs ever. The Vice President of the U.S. hated it at the time. Let's get into this amazing story next on Professor of Rock. Hey music junkies, Professor of Rock, always here to celebrate the greatest artists and the greatest songs of all time. You know, if you have ever sat down and listened to an entire album, an LP front to back, this is your place. Subscribe below right now, make sure to click the bell so you never miss out on our daily content. You're gonna dig this channel, I know you will. We also have a Patreon. There you're going to find additional content, including our new live series that goes behind the scenes of our live events. And you can also become an honorary producer to help us curate this music history. So it's time for another edition of Number One in Our Hearts. This is a show that honors songs that were so incredible that they absolutely should have been number one on the Billboard Hot 100 chart. But they came up short for various reasons, but we celebrate them for how great they were and are. Previous episodes, we've covered Night Moves by Bob Seger, Born to Be Wild by Steppenwolf, and Riders on the Storm by The Doors, just to name a few. Now today, we're covering a song that actually did make it to number one in the UK, but it came up a mind-boggling 67 spots short on the Hot 100 here in America. It's Joe Cocker's rendition of With a Little Help from My Friends. With a little help from my friends, of course, the second track on the Beatles' 1967 concept album, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Many consider it to be the greatest album of all time. The album was loosely envisioned as a performance by the fictional Sgt. Pepper Band, as indicated by the opening title track, that flows into With a Little Help from My Friends. We hear a round of applause and the introduction of Ringo Starr's alias Billy Shears, who sings lead. The song was, of course, written by Paul McCartney and John Lennon, Lennon-McCartney. Paul McCartney claims With a Little Help from My Friends began at John Lennon's house in Weybridge under the working title Badfinger Boogie. Reportedly, it was so named after Lennon injured his finger during its composition. The song was based on one of Paul's ideas. As John Lennon would later recall, Paul had the line about a little help from my friends. He had some kind of structure for it, and we wrote it pretty well, 50-50 from that original idea. This was actually one of the last songs that the two would sit down and write together, kind of eye to eye, in the spirit of true collaboration. As McCartney and Lennon banged away abstractly at a piano, they sang, whatever phrases popped into their heads or what they heard from friends' conversations in the same room. This process stretched on for hours and was broken up with an assortment of random departures into various other songs. Now, while writing, John Lennon contributed the line, "What do we see when I turn out the light?" I can't tell you, but I know it's mine. Depending on your mood, this could be viewed in a rather juvenile bit of humor perspective, perhaps as a somewhat deeper thought as well. Although McCartney remembers giggling when John wrote it, McCartney also managed to insert a drug reference. I get high with a little help from my friends. But John Lennon, he claimed that this was not about drugs. Many people didn't believe him, including U.S. Vice President Agnew, who once called the song a tribute to the power of illegal drugs. My, what a crazy time that was. I get high with a little The friends he claimed were assorted drugs, but in a 1970 interview, Lennon argued in spite of public misconceptions. With a little help from my friends, didn't champion drug abuse. It was a sincere and comforting message. It was just a celebration of friendship. And that's the way that Ringo sings it, almost as if he's stating just a simple truth. Friends are important.
Gonna try with a little help from my friend.
Though Ringo's performance is fairly straightforward and without embellishment, there's a charming sincerity to it that makes us as listeners really believe him. His conviction is his humble interpretation. It's what Ringo does best. McCartney recalled, I think that was probably the best of our songs that we ever wrote for Ringo, actually.
Lend me your ears and I'll sing you a song and I'll try.
So there's a bit of a funny story that goes along with the song. Initially, when Paul and John wrote the lyrics, they went, "What would you do if I sang out of tune? Would you stand up and throw tomatoes at me?" Now, understandably, Ringo didn't like this line and actually flat out refused to sing it in the studio. I think he said something like, "There's not a chance in hell I'm going to sing this line." He objected. In his mind, he could already see a mob of Cavalier fans lining up to launch produce projectiles, if you will, at him while he sang, the song on stage. Mercifully, McCartney gave the line an on-spot rewrite.
Got it too. Would you stand up and walk out on me?
A little help from my friends. It was produced, of course, by George Martin and recorded at Abbey Road Studios on March 29, 1967. An additional overdubbing session followed on March 30th. The song was never released as a Beatles single, but it became one of the most enduring tracks for the group, thanks in no small part to today's featured artist. As we go into this story, I do want to thank our sponsor, Zenni Eyewear. Zenni rocks. Seriously, if you're on the lookout for a new pair of glasses or sunglasses, Zenni is the only way to go. When you go to Zenni.com, you get a chance to really design your own look from the ground up. You can choose the color, the shape, the style, and then you just get them delivered right to your door. You put in your prescription. It's very easy. Check it out at Zenni.com today. So enter the fiery rock and soul warrior, the mighty Joe Cocker. Joe Cocker's career began in 1961 with a little-known band, the Cavaliers, who changed their name to Vance Arnold and the Avengers. In 1963, they became a warm-up act for the Hollies. This led to Joe being discovered and a singles contract from Decca Records. Forward, he recorded I'll Cry Instead by the Beatles. However, when the song failed to sell, Joe was dropped. In 1966, Cocker formed the Grease Band. And after 2 solid years of playing clubs, he secured another recording session with producer Denny Cordell, who also worked with Procol Harum and the Moody Blues. And Cocker recorded the single Margarine, but without the rest of the band, which he dissolved. Then he moved to London with Chris Stainton, and Cordell set Cocker up with a residency at the Marquee Club. A new version of the Grease Band was formed with Stainton and Tommy Iyer on keyboards. Momentum really started rolling for Joe Cocker while he was at home one day singing to himself. The song, you guessed it, with a little help from my friends.
What would you do if I sang out of tune?
But instead of going along with the Beatles' standard 4/4 time, Joe sang it like a waltz, 3/4 time. As he did this, something clicked, and he knew that he needed to cover this song. But what he didn't know was that it was about to break his career wide open. At rehearsals with the Grease Band, Joe suggested they play the song as a waltz. He told organist Tommy Iyer to change the chords in the verse to make it more classical.
Would you stand up and walk out on me?
The band also added a lengthy instrumental intro and changed up the chords in the middle 8. The result was a radical and mesmerizing rearrangement of the Beatles' original. It really brought the song to life.
Oh, baby,
When it came time to record at Olympic Studios, soon-to-be Zeppelin guitarist Jimmy Page and Procol Harum, drummer B.J. Wilson, they were hired on as session players. The song took 13 takes, but in the end, they nailed it. Cocker really brought out something completely new and unexpected from the song. It's just magical. He took Ringo's charming vocals to an entirely different realm. Dripping with gospel soul, Cocker's intense vocal stylings mesh beautifully with the song's new arrangement and the production. The result was something like culminating a hymn at a church service, baptizing people into the fire of rock and roll. With a little help from my friends would land on Cocker's debut album of the same name. The record included a cluster of other impassioned covers. There was Traffic's Feeling All Right, Bob Dylan's Just Like a Woman, and I Shall Be Released.
Just like a woman, I shall be released.
The debut was released in April of '69. And though Cocker would take some heat from critics for being a covers artist, the album was a striking interpretation of other artists' music, melding soulful testimony with rock dynamics. That voice, who cares what he's saying? Cocker and the Grease Band began touring the U.S. in that same year. Performances included the Ed Sullivan Show, the Newport Rock Festival, and the Denver Pop Festival. And although these gigs helped to increase awareness for Joe Cocker and company, superstardom wouldn't come until the culmination of one legendary set later that year, Woodstock.
What would you do if I sang out of tune?
Performing at the Woodstock Festival was the biggest moment of Joe Cocker's career, no doubt. This historic music and art fair, of course, held over the weekend of August 15th through 17th, 1969, on a 600-acre dairy farm in Bethel, New York, the biggest gathering of its kind, and it attracted an estimated 500,000 people. 32 acts, leading and emerging performers played over the course of that 4 days. Jefferson Airplane, Jimi Hendrix, Creedence, Clearwater Revival, Santana, Joan Baez, The Grateful Dead, The Who, Janis Joplin, Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young. They were just some of the big-name tickets.
Somebody to love. Wouldn't you love somebody to love?
Joe Cocker was the first officially scheduled act on Sunday, August 17th. But performances were already lagging behind schedule, so actually didn't get started until 2 p.m. The crowds were so massive and entry to the festival so log-jammed that the musicians had to be flown in by helicopter. The Grease Band opened the set without Joe Cocker. They played 2 songs, Who Knows What Tomorrow May Bring and 40,000 Headmen. After Joe joined the band on stage, he kicked things off with a cover of Bob Dylan's Dear Landlord. From there on out, though, Joe Cocker took on a flurry of covers, including album cuts, Dylan and Traffic. He also channeled works from Ray Charles, Honey Bus, and the Coasters. For good measure, Cocker and the Grease Band also contributed one of their own original pieces, Something's Coming On. So memorable. He was wearing a sweat-soaked, tie-dyed t-shirt. 25-year-old Joe Cocker put on the show of his life, guaranteeing himself the reputation of an entertainer who would leave it all on the stage. Contributing to this perception was not only his expressive vocal style, but also some very unorthodox stage moves. Cocker appeared to be like spazzing out at times and playing the air guitar like no one was watching. But it was Joe Cocker's finale that he would be best remembered for. Woodstock's Soul Man kicked out what has become his signature moment in time, an all-out, balls-to-the-wall, full-throttle emotional portrayal of With a Little Help from My Friends. Man, Cocker and his band's performance of the song just intensely magnetic, converting the already noteworthy song into an awe-inspired, glorious musical drama.
Do I do when my love is away?
What Joe Cocker said about it: when we got into With a Little Help from My Friends, I felt as though we got toward the end of the tune and we'd caught the massive consciousness. I suddenly felt like I'd got them to accept what we were doing. It was a powerful feeling for me. And he couldn't have been more right. It was like he was preaching a blazing sermon wherein the audience was enthralled, hanging on every single word, every nuance. That song perfectly embodied the essence of the gathering that weekend, and everybody knew it.
Lord, 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 how do I feel?
From that moment on, as blasphemous as it might sound, Cocker's version of With a Little Help from My Friends became the preeminent take. He had done what very few, if any, can claim. He had actually improved upon a Fab Four composition. And from that day forward, it was his song.
You said no more. Gonna get love, my friend.
As if to punctuate the enormity of the moment, all through Cocker's set, a storm was building. Dark clouds were rolling in, and the wind was picking up. His wild, impassioned movements, maybe it was like a rain dance, because it appeared as though he had just summoned a tempest. Then just after his set ended, a huge thunderstorm hit and all hell broke loose. Waves of torrential water poured from the sky, soaking hundreds of thousands of people. It was a mighty baptism of rock and roll from the heavens, washing these new Joe Cocker converts clean in a moment of supernatural reverence. Not surprisingly, the festival was brought to a halt for a couple hours. Now, when Woodstock weekend was over, Joe Cocker, who was fairly unknown going into this, he had emerged as an undisputed star. So you might be wondering, how did the Beatles react to Joe Cocker's cover? Well, they loved it as much as the rest of us. In fact, they sent Cocker a telegram that read, "Thanks, you are far too much." Decades later, when Joe Cocker sadly passed away in 2014 at age 70, McCartney reaffirmed his praise. He said, "It's really sad to hear about Joe's passing. He was a lovely northern lad who I loved a lot, and like many people, I loved his singing. I was especially pleased when he decided to cover With a Little Help from My Friends. And I remember him playing me what they'd recorded, and it was just mind-blowing. Totally turned the song into a soul anthem, and I was forever grateful to him for doing that." Can you imagine getting a telegram like that from Paul McCartney?
What do I do when my love is away?
Joe Cocker's recorded version of the song went on to hit number 1 in the UK, like I said, but it only made it to number 68 on the Billboard Hot 100. However, it did also go to number 1 in Belgium and Switzerland, and it went to number 2 in the Netherlands. With a little help from my friends, the album was certified gold in the US, and it peaked at number 35 on the Billboard 200. But the song's subsequent pop culture life has been massive for both versions, really. For the Beatles, it was featured in The Muppet Show in 1980, Across the Universe in 2007, Flight in 2012, Gilmore Girls, A Year in the Life in 2016.
With a little help from my friends, do you need friends?
Yes, I with a little help from his friends.
You can also play With a Little Help from My Friends for yourself in the Beatles Rock Band video game.
No, I get by with a little help from my friends.
Meanwhile, Joe Cocker's version of the song was featured in one of the most memorable media placements ever. The opening to the original Wonder Years starring Fred Savage, my favorite TV show of all time.
What would you do if I sang out of tune?
In terms of pure emotional nostalgia and cultural significance, I gotta say, few TV openings have ever reached the heights that this intro did. I mean, for every Gen Xer growing up in the late 80s and early 90s, the placement of this song on the Wonder Years might be just as iconic for them as Joe Cocker's Woodstock performance was for their parents, the baby boomers.
I don't need lend me your ear.
Like I said, my favorite show of all time. I remember watching this show every single week with my dad. It was the one show we always saw together. He was the same age as Kevin Arnold, and so the memories would just flood. And he'd tell me after every episode where he was, what he heard. Every time I hear this song, it just takes me back to those priceless moments every single week when I watched this wondrous show with my dad. It's like I got to know my dad through that show. Cocker's cover also made its way into The Simpsons in '94 and the Grand Tour in 2016.
Oh, baby, I will try not to sing out of key.
Cocker's Woodstock performance was also famously parodied by John Belushi on Saturday Night Live. The list of other musicians who have covered this song is really long, so I'll just give you a sampling. Beach Boys did it in '67, Ike and Tina Turner in '69, Santana did it.
I'm gonna try with a little help from my friends.
Wet, 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 which actually went to #1 in the UK. Bon Jovi did it in '93, Toto did it, Sam and Mark, which also went to #1 in the UK. Sarah Bareilles did it, Cheap Trick, Mumford & Sons, and Billy Joel just did it a few years ago. It's a song that, as much as any other, is the essence of perfectly enlightened rock and soul. Joe Cocker, one of the greatest voices ever. He gave everything he had in that performance, and with a little help from his friends, the Beatles, gifted a song to the world that will truly stand the test of time to infinity and beyond. Leave us a comment about Joe Cocker and this soulful 60s cover. What are your memories of With a Little Help from My Friends, and which version do you think is better, Joe's or the Beatles? Guess it depends on if you're soulful or if you like kind of the fun version. Anyway, tell us below. Let's have a good discussion. Make sure to check out some of our other Beatles content. We have the stories behind Hey Jude, Penny Lane, and Something. And if you dig this content, don't forget to subscribe below. We'd love to have you. That way you never miss out on any of our interviews or story songs. We'd love to have you as part of this community that's all about keeping the music alive. Until next time, 3 chords and the truth, my friends.